Well, this is part 2 of my Great West Road trilogy or quadrology, depending on how well it goes and how little I waffle. So, already started to waffle, that's not a good sign. This picks up on the end of the last one, and this is called Wallis House, but it was originally built for Simmons Air Accessories, an aircraft component manufacturer, between 1936 and 1942. It was then taken over in 1947 by BOAC, which is British Overseas Airline Corporation, and then it was passed on to Beechams, the pharmaceuticals company, which then became SmithKline Beecham, which then became GlaxoSmithKline. So GlaxoSmithKline gave up on this building in the early 2000s, I think. And then there was a chance that it was going to be demolished. Actually, in 1994 they wanted to have it demolished so they could rebuild, but fortunately it was protected and became a listed building, which is good, really. A lot of the back of the original factory's all been chopped out because they turned it all into apartments and offices, but the frontage was kept because obviously that was the most important thing. This building on the corner was originally a bank. It was a Midland bank, and I think there was another bank at the other end which is the same sort of style, but this is possibly one of the best of the showpiece factories on the Great West Road now, because obviously the Firestone factory was pulled down. It's further up the road, so I'm just going to walk along. Very dicey, very busy road on both levels. Over on the other side of the road is a big Mercedes showrooms, which is funny bit, but Mercedes have been on that site since the late 50s, I think. So you can see how this building has had a certain amount of modernisation, but it's been done quite respectfully. It's a brick finished building, and the architects were Wallace, Gilbert and Partners, who did the Hoover factory, the Firestone factory, and many other factories along this road. So this is the glass addition on the frontage here for the entrance is the major change. And just zoom back up and show you there is Inspiration to Flight, which is a pilot figure with some wings behind him. And I fail to remember the name of the sculptor. So on this side of the road, Beecham's built an extension. That tower is obviously new, but it does sort of fit in with the whole concept of impressive buildings. I'm just going to show you here proof. There we are. The SA stands for Simmons Air Accessories, but at a later stage that was replaced with B's for Beecham, so on the extension. Now I think I'm going to stay on this side of the road for a little while. Try and keep it relevant if I can. I'll show you the other end of the building. That would be a good thing to do. So more of these, you can see. But again, as I said in the first part of the video, part 1, this elevated section that was put up in the mid-60s really damaged the whole feel of this road in terms of how the industrial buildings and office buildings presented themselves, because basically you couldn't see onto the other side of the road without this getting in the way. From the top deck, of course, yes, you can see it all, and you do get to see the figure of the pilot. This is the other end of the building, so at one end you had the bank, and I think there was a bank at this end as well, but I could be wrong, and I probably am. Here's what I mean, look, B for Beechams. So they had that put in, but quite handily it's also B for Barrett. So there's the Mercedes showrooms. On the other side of the road are the showrooms for Audi, but on that site was the site of the Lucasade building. I don't believe it was a factory, I think it was actually warehousing and distribution, but at the top of the building was a very famous part of Great West Road history, because it was where the Lucozade kinetic sign, which was a bottle pouring out Lucozade into a glass, and the original signage that said Lucozade AIDS Recovery, and that was then changed for obvious reasons in the 80s. And that remained on the building until the building was pulled down at some point in the 1990s, and they had to move it further down the road, and I can possibly show you that as I move along, if I've got enough room. Now, there was an assemblage of buildings on this side of the road that I do know about, having looked at James Marshall's fantastic books. James Marshall being a historian, and there was a factory for the Burgoyne radio factory, and then also just a bit further along Alvis, the car company who had repair shops. So there's a lot of car related business, as still to this day, on this road. Now, the set of factories on the other side of the road there, where you've got Quick Fit, I can tell you there was a company called Pullin who made electrical motors, very small electrical motors, back in the 1950s, 40s and 50s. What that factory looked like, I've only seen a couple of pictures. It wasn't particularly remarkable, but interesting all the same. So I'm going to pause now, and we're just going to move a bit further up the road. Right, so I just moved past, that's the junction with Ealing Road, and there's the Audi showrooms again. So back on the other side of the road. This is where the Lucozade signage ended up, on this building here, which is part of a row of shops and flats. And what GlaxoSmithKline, who owned the Lucozade brand at that point, decided to do, together with JC Deco, the sign company, who just happened to have their offices on the Great West Road, what they did was they took this 30s style building, which is a 30s building, and they built an extension, and you can see where the extension was. It's where that fluting is, where that stops, and then it sort of changes it. You can see there's an obvious difference. So they built, fabricated an extension, and the reason why they did that was so that they could put the Lucozade signage back on the side of the building, so then it could be seen from the elevated section, because it was always part of people's trip into London from Heathrow, was looking out for the Lucozade sign. That all sort of went when they decided to take all the signage off, all the old dimensional signage, and put a screen, advertising screen. And that was initially all just Lucozade all the time, but then that's all gone. So the Lucozade thing's all finished. You can see where there's a join in the building there. So although that's not a factory, it is to do with the sort of the history of the Great West Road. These flats and shops which would have been put up, I'd imagine probably the late 20s, early 30s. There's another bit of industrial archaeology of sorts, history anyway, just past these shops, because there's a big substation, electrical substation. This one seems to get missed out quite a lot when people talk about the Great West Road, but it's important because without it, power supply would have been a bit of a problem for some of the factories. But in itself, it's quite fascinating period architecture with these little outbuildings. Sorry about that. There you go. If I close in, I might be able to read what it says. Nope. But this is all owned by Power Networks, or whatever they're called, UK Power Networks. But it's quite a sort of imposing building, but it has a certain style about it, very industrial style. It does actually say what it is on here somewhere. It just calls Brentford. Substation name, Brentford. You see these little outbuildings here as well. This is where there's bits of kit inside. And they're interesting in their own way. They've got a certain sort of quality about them with these roofs on them. And this then beside it is just a little sort of pathway that goes to the housing, because this is where you hit the housing. And this is a bit that gets missed out when people talk about the Great West Road, is that in fact actually this area, as well as having fields, etc., etc., but there was housing already from a previous time. And this row of houses here, terrace of houses, these will date from possibly, I'd say, the period running up to the First World War, so 1900, 1914. Quite why they were built, I don't know. There may have been some form of industry of sorts here. But there's a bit that John Rogers filmed. Actually, he did a video on the Great West Road about 3 years ago. And he went down this road here, where there was a pub on the corner originally, and the pub sign's still there. And I would say go and have a look at John's video, because rather than me repeating it, he has a fascinating insight into down there. You can see there's some buildings which are quite old. Actually, I'm trying to close in on them. And he recounts the making of a film by Ealing Studios in the 1950s. So go and have a look for that. John Rogers, who's very well known for there. Look, there's a route master going through. Look at that. He does walking videos. If you don't know about John Rogers, go and check him out. But he did a video about that, and he goes into a fascinating insight. I'm not going to repeat it because that wouldn't be right, would it? You know, he does his thing. So these houses here, somewhere again, there's, I think, some footage from Thames Archive in which a reporter is talking to people who live in these houses, and the sort of problems they had with noise and pollution. Basically, they were saying they couldn't have the windows open, which obviously isn't the case now. But yeah, that's another little insight. In fact, these houses, I think there were houses on the other side of the road too, but there was some changes. But these are pre-Great West Road, so pre-1925. And initially, presumably, when the vehicular traffic on this road was less aggressive than it is now, it wasn't so bad, but certainly by the time you get to the 1930s, that changed. So just getting to the end of that terrace of houses, and over the other side of the road, you can see how you have another bit of green. And that, I said this when I did my radio slot about the Great West Road, is that it's not all the factories and the old factory buildings, they're not in one big chunk. It's not a continuous ribbon. There's an initial bit, there's a break, which is where we are now, and then it starts up again after Boston Manor Road, which this will be a natural point for me to break. But here, there used to be, this is Curry Motors now, but it was originally a factory, a splendid Art Deco factory called, I think it was called Windmill, the Windmill Garage. And if you just look that up online, you'll see some pictures of it, I'm sure, if you look hard enough. But it was, I don't know when it was pulled down, but it's a bit of a shame that it was, because it was a real showpiece. And here, this is, I only just noticed something, but this on the corner here of Windmill Road, because there obviously was a windmill down that road, there was a business called Performance Cars. Again, you can look that up and find some information about them. But on the side of a brick wall, which is gone now, there used to be the word Performance Cars, and they used to deal with things like MG and various sports cars. I've just noticed that this building that has gone up in the last 5 years or so is actually called Performance Point. So they have made a reference to the past, which is quite nice. There we go, Performance Point. It would be nice to put a car there, that would have helped a little bit. Just down there you can see there's a pub called the Globe, which I have been in and is very nice. It's a Fuller's pub, so it will be nice. So I'm going to move along, traffic permitting. I should have scoped this, as they say. You should actually think about what you're doing before you do it. It's something my father always used to say to me, and I've always been the same way. I'm rather rash and impulsive. I have a terrible attitude towards planning things, but that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to plan, and therefore if I'd thought about this, I could have walked these sections, talked it through in my head, and thought there's no way it's going to be one video. So that's why it's going to have to be more than one. So I'm going to run this particular section, part 2, up to the corner of Boston Manor Road, and then I'll do the section after that. I may even have to do 2 sections for that bit, but the bit I'm coming up to at the junction of Boston Manor Road is really where the greatest concentration of industrial showpiece factories were. On the other side of the road, what is now, I think, apartments. Boring bus stop, thank you. Was a hospital, but it's now been turned into apartments. Just make that out. There you go. Quite an obvious sort of 1930s hospital type building. Not industrial, but I mean, what a place to put a flipping hospital next to a busy road. Which explains why it isn't a hospital anymore. But again, here we see these are quite obviously Victorian houses. And I know, having looked at some pictures, if you go and have a look at old maps on the National Libraries of Scotland, have a website for old Ordnance Survey maps, I know that they chopped a whole load of houses down on this section here to make room for the road. There's also sort of curves. You notice how there's a bit of a curve to the road? Presumably it's to do with land rights and how the land was bought up to do this. But this is where the elevated section, thankfully, it takes a diversion off. And the whole physicality of the road changes from this sort of very concrete structure to then steel, noticeable steel work. And why that is, I don't know. I don't know whether it was to do with costs. I don't know whether it was to do with the fact that it was deemed as being safer. I really have no idea, but it's a very noticeable difference in the way that the road looks, the elevated section. But as you can see, it's almost a reprieve, it's almost like a relief as you get away from the horrible shadows of being stuck under the elevated section into the open. And this is where you really start to get a feel back again of what this road was when it was originally sort of opened, and as it developed through the late 20s into the 30s, 40s and 50s. It's had a decline after that, which hopefully I can sort of talk about. But again, I mean, it's very impressive architecture, this is without a doubt. And there you can see over there, there's a church, a Catholic church. So you can see how this road had its impact quite noticeably. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'll then pick up in the third video on the corner of Boston Manor Road. I think I need to have a cup of coffee. But just over there you'll see that that is the Great West House. That was originally built for an American computer company called Honeywell. But I will explain in the third video what was originally on that site. So thank you for watching, and remember, go to part 3.